The wind carried dust across the fading trail, whispering between dry sage and brittle weeds that clung to the earth. The sky hung low and heavy with the orange light of a dying sun, and in that lonely stretch of land, a woman in a long traveling coat struggled to keep her footing. Her boots, made for city streets and not for the wild, slipped on loose gravel as she led her horse by the reins. The world around her was nothing like she'd imagined. No friendly townsfolk, no tidy fences, no sign of safety, only the endless emptiness of the desert and the sharp cry of a hawk overhead. Her name didn't matter much out here. The prairie didn't care where she came from, nor did it care about her fine accent or her lace gloves. The stagecoach that was supposed to carry her to the next town had broken down miles back, and the driver had refused to go farther at night, saying this was Apache country. But she hadn't listened. She had a reason to go on, one she wouldn't speak aloud. Now, with night falling and the air growing cold, she began to realize how far she'd wandered from everything she understood. When she saw smoke rising in the distance, a thin gray column twisting against the fading light, she thought it might be a miracle, a campfire, maybe a ranch, or even a traveler. Her heart lifted. She hurried her steps, clutching her coat tighter around her body as the chill deepened. The scent of burning wood carried through the air, mixed with something wilder, older, and unfamiliar. By the time she reached the clearing, the light had dimmed into a copper dusk. There was a small cabin at the base of a red hill, its rough logs darkened by time and weather. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney. A single horse stood tied to the post outside. Everything was quiet, so quiet she could hear the crackle of the fire inside. She hesitated. Something about the place felt still, too still, like the woods were holding their breath. Then the door opened. He stepped out without a word. His tall frame blocked the firelight, casting a shadow across the dust. The woman froze. His hair was long, black as night, falling over his shoulders. His skin, marked by the sun and the desert wind, gleamed with strength. Small tribal tattoos traced near his collarbone and down his arm, and pieces of bone and silver hung from his neck. He wasn't dressed like any man she'd ever seen. No hat, no jacket, no polished boots, only raw presence, unbothered by the cold. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the lonely cry of the wind against the cabin walls. "You're far from the town," he said finally, his voice deep, calm, but edged with warning. "This isn't land for people like you," she swallowed hard. "My horse went lame. I've been walking since noon. I thought I saw smoke." He studied her in silence. There was something unreadable in his dark eyes, something both dangerous and patient. "You saw right," he said at last. "But you should have turned back when the sun did." Her lips trembled, though she tried to hide it. "I had no choice." He didn't answer. He turned his back and went inside, leaving the door open. The firelight spilled onto the porch, flickering against the rough boards. She stood there a moment longer, unsure if it was an invitation or a test. Her body ached from the long walk, and the cold had sunk deep into her bones. Against her better judgment, she followed him in. Inside, the cabin was simple but strong. Animal hides covered the floor, and the air smelled faintly of pine smoke and leather. There was a rifle resting by the wall, a kettle simmering near the fire, and a low bed of furs pushed into the corner. Everything seemed ordered, precise, as if nothing here happened by accident. He was sitting by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes. "You can rest there," he said without looking up, nodding toward a small bench. She hesitated. "Thank you." Her voice came out softer than she intended. She sat, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to warm them by the fire. He glanced at her again, his eyes sharp. "You shouldn't be here." "I didn't come to cause trouble," she said quietly. "I only need a place to stay until morning. Then I'll go." He stopped sharpening the blade and laid it across his knee. "You think this land will let you go that easy?" She didn't know how to answer that. The desert outside howled through the cracks in the logs, and the fire flared like it agreed with him. She looked down at her gloves, now torn and dirty. "I'm not afraid." His lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "You should be." There was something about the way he said it, calm, certain, that sent a shiver through her. He wasn't threatening her. He was warning her. About what? She couldn't tell. He stood and went to the door, looking out into the night. The sky had turned almost black, the stars sharp and cold. "You're lucky you found this place before dark," he said. "There are worse things than hunger out there." She looked up at him, curiosity battling fear. "And what about in here?" He turned his head slowly, meeting her eyes across the room. The firelight caught on his tattoos, on the silver hanging from his neck, on the faint scars across his chest. His gaze didn't waver. "Depends," he said. "On how much you test my limits." The words hung between them, heavy and sure. The fire crackled, and for a long time neither of them moved. The woman's breath caught, not because she felt danger exactly, but because she couldn't read what kind it was. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the window shutters. The night seemed to close in, swallowing everything beyond the cabin walls. She took a slow breath. "I didn't mean to come here. I only wanted shelter." He nodded once, still watching her. "Shelter is earned in this land, not taken." Her heart pounded. "Then tell me what I must do." He didn't answer right away. He walked to the fire, crouching beside it. The light painted his skin in warm gold and shadow. "You can stay," he said finally. "But you don't speak of where I live. Not to anyone. And you do what I tell you while you're under my roof. No questions." She hesitated. "I'll try." "Don't try," he said quietly. "Do it. Or the next time you see that horizon, it'll be the last thing you see." The words made her chest tighten, but she couldn't tell if he meant them as a warning or a promise. She didn't know this man, didn't know what ghosts might live behind his eyes. But as she sat by the fire, she realized something else. He could have left her outside to freeze, but he hadn't. He'd opened his door, and somehow that frightened her even more. As the night deepened, she watched him move around the cabin, silent as a shadow. He didn't ask her questions, didn't look at her again. The only sound was the steady rhythm of the fire and the wind outside. When she finally gathered the courage to speak, her voice was little more than a whisper. "Why did you let me in?" He didn't turn around. "Because I remember what it's like to be lost." Something in his tone caught her off guard. A weariness, maybe sorrow, buried deep beneath the roughness. She wanted to ask more, but his shoulders tensed slightly, and she knew the conversation was over. Hours later, when she thought he'd fallen asleep, she looked toward the window. The moonlight spilled faintly through the cracks, silvering the edges of the room. She wondered what kind of man lived alone in a place like this, what had driven him away from the world. And then, in the silence, she heard it. A faint sound outside. A twig snapping, footsteps in the dark. Her eyes widened. She turned to the man by the fire, but he was already standing, knife in hand, his expression suddenly cold and alert. He moved to the door without a sound and whispered one last warning before stepping out into the night. "Stay where you are, and don't test my limits." The door shut, leaving her alone with the fire's dying glow. The desert wind moaned outside, and in that moment, she realized she was trapped between two dangers, the ones outside his cabin, and the one standing guard just beyond the door. The door creaked as it shut behind him, and the silence that followed felt heavier than the desert air outside. The woman sat frozen, her fingers clutched around the edges of the bench, listening to the soft hiss of the fire and the distant sound of boots crunching against dry earth. The light inside the cabin flickered as the flames struggled against the draft. She could see her breath in the cold, thin air. For a moment, she thought of running. Maybe if she slipped out the back window, she could follow the moonlight down the hill, find the trail she had lost hours ago. But when she looked at the shadows moving across the dirt floor, she knew it was foolish. Out there were things she didn't understand. Wolves, men, maybe worse. In here, at least, there was fire and him, whoever he was. The wind howled, carrying faint echoes from somewhere in the dark. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it sent a chill through her. She leaned forward, staring at the door as if she could see through it. After what felt like an hour but could have been minutes, the latch lifted again. He stepped back inside, quiet as a ghost. The knife in his hand glinted in the firelight, now streaked with dust. He shut the door and set the blade down on the table without a word. His chest rose and fell slowly. "What was it?" she asked. "Nothing you need to worry about." His tone was calm, but there was a tension in his shoulders, a sharpness in his movements that hadn't been there before. She swallowed hard. "I heard something out there." He didn't meet her eyes. "You hear many things in these hills. Most of them don't care about you." "And the ones that do?" she asked softly. His jaw tightened. "Those are the ones you shouldn't be talking to me about." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She looked down at her hands, tracing the dirt under her fingernails, the torn fabric at her cuff. City life had never prepared her for this roughness, this silence, this strange man whose every word felt like a test. After a long pause, she asked, "You live here alone?" He looked up finally. "Since the war ended, That caught her attention. You were a soldier? He hesitated, as if the question scraped across something he'd buried deep. Not in your army, he said quietly. But yes, I fought. She studied him, his calmness, his watchful eyes. And now you live out here, why? He shrugged one shoulder. The land doesn't ask questions. People do. There was something in the way he said it that silenced her. She looked around the cabin again, at the few things he owned. No books, no pictures, no comforts, only tools and weapons, and a small carved wooden figure sitting on the shelf near the window. She stood slowly and stepped closer to it. Did you carve this? She asked. His eyes followed her. Don't touch it. She froze. It's for the dead, he said, his tone soft but unyielding. You leave it where it stands. She stepped back, murmuring an apology. He turned away again, tossing another piece of wood into the fire. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, low and rolling across the mountains. She hadn't noticed the clouds building. Through the small window, the horizon was now a black mass, and the smell of rain crept into the air. He noticed her watching. Storm's coming, he said. It'll flood the lower trails. You won't be going anywhere tonight. She nodded slowly, unsure whether to feel relieved or trapped. He poured water from a clay jug into a tin cup and handed it to her. Drink. You look like you've gone days without it. She hesitated, then accepted it. The water was cold, sharp with a taste of metal. She didn't realize how thirsty she was until she'd emptied the cup. Thank you, she said softly. He nodded once, expression unreadable. Where were you headed before your horse gave up? She hesitated. To the next town. I was looking for someone. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. A man? Her eyes flickered toward the fire. No, a brother. He left home years ago. Last letter said he was somewhere near the river valley. He studied her, silent for a long moment. That's 3 days' ride from here. You walked in the wrong direction. The truth of it sank deep. She closed her eyes briefly. Then I really am lost. He didn't answer. He walked past her, grabbed a blanket from the corner and set it beside the bench. You'll sleep here. Don't open the door tonight, no matter what you hear. She frowned. You mean the storm? I mean what the storm brings with it. His words left a cold weight in the room. He blew out the lantern near the table and settled on the floor near the hearth, his back to her, knife resting beside his hand. The fire dimmed to embers. She lay down, the rough wool blanket scratching her skin, and tried to sleep. But the sounds outside wouldn't let her. The low rumble of thunder, the whine of wind through the cracks, and something else, faint but steady, like footsteps circling the cabin. Hours passed. She drifted in and out of uneasy dreams until a sudden noise jolted her awake. A sharp thud, close, maybe against the wall. Her heart raced. She turned her head slowly. The Apache was already sitting up, eyes open, knife in hand. He hadn't been asleep at all. He motioned for silence. They both listened. The sound came again. Another soft, dragging scrape just beyond the door. Then stillness. The air inside felt heavy, tense, charged. He rose without a word, moving with quiet precision. He unlatched the door and slipped out into the rain. She sat upright, clutching the blanket. The storm had grown wild now, wind shrieking through the canyon, rain beating against the roof. She wanted to look outside, but fear rooted her in place. Minutes crawled by. Then the door swung open again. He entered, dripping wet, his face hard. What was it? She asked, voice trembling. He wiped rain from his arms and said flatly, Tracks, too close to the cabin. They weren't made by an animal. Then by who? He didn't answer. He just looked toward the fire, jaw tight. She tried to make sense of it, but her mind was spinning. Are we in danger? He met her eyes then, and the honesty in his look chilled her more than the storm. Always. He tossed another log into the fire and sat back down, eyes still on the door. The flicker of light caught the sharp lines of his face, the calmness that came not from peace, but from a man who had lived too long with danger. After a while, he spoke again, quieter this time. There were men riding through this valley a week ago. They're not from here. They think the gold in the old mine still lies untouched. Does it? She asked. His lips twitched faintly. If it did, I'd be long gone. So they're looking for you? He shook his head. They're looking for anyone who's still breathing. She felt the chill again. You think they'll come here? He leaned forward, feeding the fire. They already have. She watched him in silence, realizing then that whatever had happened to this man, whatever ghosts lived behind those dark eyes, it wasn't something she'd read about in any city paper. He belonged to the land in a way she never could. When the rain softened toward dawn, she finally closed her eyes. Sleep came in fragments, filled with images of running horses, burning hills, and faces she didn't know. When she woke, the fire was still burning low. The Apache was gone again. For a moment, panic gripped her chest. She stood peering out the window. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and still. The ground outside was streaked with mud, and a thin mist clung to the trees. Then she saw him, standing at the edge of the clearing, his figure half lost in the fog. He was watching something in the distance, motionless. When he turned and saw her in the window, he motioned her to stay inside. But she couldn't help it. She stepped outside, her boots sinking in wet earth. The air smelled of rain and pine. He turned sharply. "I told you to stay in." "I wanted to see," she said quietly. "You've been watching the same hills for an hour." He looked back toward the ridge. "Because someone's watching us." Her stomach tightened. "You mean the men you spoke of?" He nodded. "Tracks don't lie. 3 horses. Fresh." Her voice trembled. "What will they do if they find this cabin?" His gaze stayed fixed on the horizon. "They'll test my limits." She remembered his warning from the night before. "Don't test my limits," and suddenly understood it wasn't just for her. It was for anyone who crossed that invisible line between his silence and his fury. When he finally turned toward her, the early light caught the water on his skin, and his expression was calm but fierce, like a man who'd already made peace with whatever came next. "Get inside," he said quietly. "If they reach this valley by noon, you'll learn why I live alone." And as she stepped back toward the door, she realized something unsettling. Whatever danger was coming for him, it was coming for her too. The morning light was pale and uncertain, filtered through the thinning mist that clung to the red hills. The woman stood by the cabin door, her arms wrapped tight around herself, watching the Apache move silently through the clearing. He crouched, near the mud, tracing the edge of a hoofprint with his finger. The wind stirred his long black hair, lifting the loose strands that fell across his face. He was calm, too calm for someone who believed danger was coming. That frightened her more than anything. "How long ago were they here?" she asked softly. He didn't look up. "Less than an hour." Her breath caught. "Then they're close." "They're watching," he said, rising slowly, "waiting to see if this place is worth their trouble." She felt a chill even though the sun was climbing. "Who are they?" "Men from the old mining towns," he said. "Drifters, thieves, maybe worse." His gaze drifted toward the ridge where the pines thickened. "They think there's gold still buried out here. They think I'm hiding it." "And are you?" she asked before she could stop herself. He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes unreadable. "If I was, I wouldn't still be here." He stepped past her, went to the horse tied at the post, and began tightening the reins. She watched him, her stomach twisting with questions she was afraid to ask. "You're leaving?" "I'm riding ahead to see where their trail leads," he said, checking his rifle. "You'll stay inside, lock the door, don't open it for anything." Her voice shook. "You can't just leave me here alone." He looked at her then, and something in his expression softened. "You're safer in the cabin. If they find you out there, I won't be able to reach you in time." She wanted to argue, but his tone left no room for it. She nodded. "What if they come while you're gone?" He slid the rifle over his shoulder. "Then remember what I said. Don't test my limits." Before she could say another word, he was gone, riding down the trail into the fog, the sound of hooves fading into the distance. She stood in the doorway for a long time, staring after him. The cabin felt larger without him there, emptier. The silence pressed against her ears. She bolted the door and sat by the fire, trying to keep her mind from running wild. Hours passed. The light shifted, shadows lengthened, and still he didn't return. She tried to distract herself, tidying the few things in the cabin, mending a tear in her skirt, pouring water into the kettle. But the quiet was unbearable. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made her flinch. Then she saw it through the window, a flicker of movement near the edge of the trees. She froze. For a moment, she thought it might be him returning. But the figure that stepped into view wasn't him. It was a man in a torn coat, his hat low, leading a tired horse. He stopped near the fence, scanning the clearing. Then another man appeared behind him, and another. There were 3 in all, just as the Apache had said. They spoke to each other in low voices, their laughter sharp and cruel in the still air. One of them pointed toward the cabin. Her heart pounded. She backed away from the window, trying not to breathe too loud. They were coming closer. A loud knock echoed through the cabin. "Anyone home?" a rough voice called out. She didn't answer. Another knock, harder this time. "We saw smoke. Just looking for some food and a place to rest. Open up." She pressed her back to the wall, clutching her hands together to keep them from shaking. The voice turned colder. "You gonna open, or do we break it down?" For a moment she thought the door would give way, but then another sound broke through, the sharp crack of a rifle in the distance. One of the men shouted, the others cursed, scrambling for cover. Through the window she saw them dive behind rocks. A second shot rang out, closer this time. Then silence. She waited, afraid to move. Minutes later the door opened. It was him. He stepped inside, face grim, rifle still in hand. "They found you," she whispered. "They were looking for anyone who'd answer," he said. "I warned them off." Her eyes flicked toward the ridge. "Did you?" "They'll live," he said shortly. "For now." He closed the door and bolted it again. The calm in his voice didn't match the look in his eyes, steady, but burning with something dangerous. She watched him set the rifle down and pour water into a bowl, washing the dirt and blood from his hands. "They won't stop, will they?" "No," he said. "Not until they get what they came for." "And what is that?" He hesitated, drying his hands on a cloth. "This land, what's left of it?" She frowned. "You mean they want to take it?" He nodded. "They've been taking it piece by piece for years, first from my people, now from each other." There was a quiet pain in his tone that caught her off guard. She wanted to ask more, but he turned away, tending the fire. "You said you were in a war," she said softly. "Was it because of that?" He didn't look at her. "The war I fought ended long before yours began." She waited, hoping he'd say more. Finally he spoke again, his voice low. "My tribe used to hunt along these rivers. The soldiers came, burned the camps, said it was for peace. My brother fought back. I fought beside him. He didn't live long enough to see peace come." She felt her chest tighten. "And you stayed here?" He looked up at her then, eyes sharp with old grief. Someone had to remember what was taken. For a moment, neither spoke. The firelight flickered between them, painting the cabin walls in shades of gold and shadow. Then he said quietly, "You didn't come this far from the city just to find your brother." She blinked, startled. "What makes you say that? You talk like someone who's running, not searching." Her throat went dry. "You don't know anything about me. I know fear when I see it," he said, "and guilt." She turned away, trying to hide the trembling in her hands. "Maybe I just made mistakes." He studied her a long moment. "Out here, mistakes get people buried." His words lingered in the air. She wanted to tell him everything. The reason she'd left the city, the letter she'd hidden in her coat pocket, the man whose name she couldn't bear to say. But something held her back. Outside, the wind began to rise again, sweeping through the valley like a warning. By evening, the sky had turned crimson. The Apache stood outside sharpening his knife, while she sat by the fire, trying to quiet her thoughts. She couldn't stop replaying the gunshots in her mind, wondering how close she'd come to dying before he returned. When he came back inside, she asked quietly, "What happens when they come again?" He looked at her with that same calm, unreadable expression. "Then we find out how far they're willing to go." "And how far are you?" He slid the knife into its sheath. farther than they expect. She studied him, realizing that for all his warnings there was something protective about the way he watched her, something he was trying not to show. She wondered if he'd always lived with his back to the world, waiting for the next fight. Later that night, she couldn't sleep. She sat near the fire, listening to the faint hum of crickets outside. The Apache had fallen silent again, his eyes half closed as if resting, though she doubted he ever truly slept. After a long time, she spoke. "You could have let me die out there." He opened his eyes, looking at her through the dim light. "I could have." "Then why didn't you?" He paused. "Because the last person I left in the desert didn't deserve it either." Her heart ached at the sound of his voice, steady but hollow. She wanted to ask who that person was, but she already knew it was tied to the wooden carving on the shelf, to the grief that followed him like a shadow. Before dawn, he was gone again, his horse tracks fresh in the mud. She found a note carved, roughly into the wood by the door. "Stay inside until I return. Don't follow." But as the sun broke over the ridge, she saw smoke rising in the distance, black, heavy, too close. Her heart raced. She grabbed the rifle from beside the hearth, stepping outside into the chill morning air. From the hill, she could see movement down near the river, 3 riders again circling the valley like wolves. They were closer this time, and one of them was dragging something behind his horse, something that made her blood run cold. She couldn't tell what it was until the wind shifted, and she saw the dark hair and red cloth of the Apache's saddle blanket. He wasn't moving. For a long moment she couldn't breathe. Then instinct took over. She ran back to the cabin, loaded the rifle with trembling hands, and set it against the windowsill. Her heart hammered in her chest as she whispered to herself, "You said not to test your limits, but they already have." The wind rose again, carrying the smell of smoke and gunpowder. And as she steadied her aim, she knew the storm he'd warned her about wasn't coming. It had already arrived. The sound of the wind had changed. It no longer whispered through the trees. It howled, carrying with it the smell of ash and fear. The woman stood by the window, her hands gripping the rifle so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Down in the valley, the 3 riders circled slowly, their figures dark against the pale earth. One of them tugged at the reins of a horse that wasn't his. The sight of the red saddle blanket dragging through the mud tore something inside her chest. She didn't know if the Apache was dead or alive. The thought burned through her like fever. Every sound outside, the creak of wood, the call of a crow, made her heart jump. She wanted to run out there, to see, to help, but she remembered his warning, the one that had kept her alive through the storm. "Don't test my limits." And yet now, it was his limits being tested, not hers. She crouched lower near the window, watching the men dismount. One carried a shotgun across his shoulder, another had a revolver that gleamed in the sunlight. They laughed as they walked toward the cabin, dragging something heavy between them. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out every other sound. Then she saw it wasn't him they were dragging. It was a sack, torn open and spilling tools, bits of fur and old cans. They'd raided his camp by the river. They were looking for gold, for something they believed he'd buried. She ducked as one of the men raised his hand and pointed toward the hill. They had seen the cabin. She backed away from the window and pressed her back to the wall. The rifle trembled in her hands. Her breathing grew quick and shallow as she tried to steady herself. She could almost hear his voice in her head, calm and low, warning her to stay still, to keep her fear quiet. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder, then they stopped. "Someone's here," one of the men called. "I see smoke from the chimney." Another voice answered, deeper, rougher. "Could be him, or that woman he picked up." The first man laughed. "Either way, we're getting in." Her pulse thundered in her ears. She looked toward the back door, but she knew there was nowhere to run. The hills were too wide, too open. If she ran, they'd catch her before she reached the river. The crunch of boots came closer. One of them tried the handle. It rattled, but held. Then came the pounding. "Open up! We just want to talk." She swallowed hard, trying to think. She'd never fired a rifle before. He'd shown her how to load it, but not how to aim, not how to pull the trigger without shaking. She whispered to herself, "Steady, steady." The voice outside grew sharper. "You open that door, lady, or we'll do it for you." She aimed the barrel toward the window, just as she'd seen him do. Her hands trembled. Her breath came in short, broken gasps. She could see their shadows moving across the porch. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, a sound tore through the valley, a wild, echoing cry that didn't belong to any man. The horses outside snorted and reared, startled. The men cursed, spinning toward the woods. Another sound followed, sharper this time, a rifle shot, clean and close. One of the men dropped to his knees with a cry. The others ducked behind the porch rail, shouting. She didn't know whether to scream or pray. Then through the smoke and dust, a dark shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was him. He moved like the wind itself, silent, sure, his rifle flashing once, twice. The second man fell back, clutching his arm. The last one fired toward the trees, the bullet splintering the cabin wall inches from her head. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Then the Apache broke cover, charging forward, knife drawn. The third man tried to aim again, but it was too late. They collided near the fence, and the sound of struggle echoed through the clearing. She ran to the door, gripping the rifle, but froze before opening it. The fight outside was fast and brutal, the clash of metal, the crack of wood, a grunt of pain. She couldn't see clearly through the dust, only the flash of movement, the glint of steel. Then silence. Her hands trembled as she slowly opened the door. He stood there, breathing hard, the knife still in his hand. His arm was bleeding, but his eyes burned steady. Behind him, the men lay still. The valley was quiet again, except for the wind pushing through the dry grass. She took a step forward. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," he said, wiping the blood from his arm. "You stayed inside." "Good." Her voice broke. "I thought they killed you." He looked at her, something unreadable passing across his face. "They tried." He walked past her into the cabin, setting his knife on the table. The fire had burned low, the coals glowing faintly. He poured water into a bowl and began washing the blood from his hands again. She watched him, still trembling, torn between relief and fear. "More will come," he said quietly. "They'll find their dead and come looking for whoever did it." Her throat tightened. "Then we have to leave." He shook his head. "You wouldn't make it 2 miles. You don't know this land." "Then what do we do?" He looked at her for a long time, his eyes heavy with something she couldn't name. "We wait. And when they come, we finish it." She stepped closer. "Why fight them? You could go. Start over somewhere else." His voice was low. "You can't start over when the ground beneath you still remembers your name." She didn't understand, not fully, but she saw the pain in his face, the kind that came from years of loss, of running from a world that never wanted to forget what it took. Outside, the sky was turning gray again. The storm had passed, but the wind hadn't. He turned suddenly, as if sensing something. "Get down." She dropped to the floor without thinking. A shot cracked through the air, splintering the window. The glass shattered, scattering across the floor. He rolled to the door, grabbed his rifle, and fired once toward the ridge. A man's cry echoed faintly. "They're already here," he said. "They didn't come for gold this time. They came for blood." He looked around the cabin quickly, scanning the walls, the door, the small window by the stove. "They'll circle us in. Try to smoke us out." She felt her heart racing again. "Can we stop them?" He met her eyes. "If we're smart." He handed her a small revolver from the shelf. "If they get inside, you don't hesitate." She stared at the weapon, her fingers trembling. "I can't." "You can," he said firmly, "or you'll die here." She nodded slowly, gripping it tight. The minutes stretched into hours. The valley grew silent except for the faint scrape of wind through the trees. Then faintly, she smelled it. The same smoke as before, thicker this time, creeping in through the cracks. He was already moving, grabbing blankets, dampening them with water, sealing the doorframe. "They're burning us out," he said. "Stay low." She coughed as the smoke thickened, stinging her eyes. She could hear voices outside now, shouting, laughing, the crackle of fire catching on dry brush. He pushed the rifle into her hands, If they break the door, you shoot toward the light. What about you? He met her eyes. I'll be waiting for them outside. Before she could stop him, he was gone, slipping out the back into the rising smoke. She crawled toward the small window, trying to see. Shadows moved in the haze, men with torches circling like wolves. Then she saw him emerge behind them, silent and swift, his knife glinting faintly through the smoke. The first man didn't even see him coming. The second turned too late. But the third fired blindly into the dark, and she saw him stumble, clutching his side. Her breath caught. No. She lifted the rifle and fired through the window. The recoil slammed against her shoulder, the shot ringing through the air. One of the men dropped his torch, the flames licking harmlessly into the mud. The others fled into the trees. She ran to the door, coughing from the smoke, and stepped outside. The wind carried the last of the fire away, leaving the clearing glowing orange. He was on his knees near the fence, one hand pressed to his wound. When he saw her, his expression hardened. I told you to stay inside. She dropped beside him, tears in her eyes. You'd be dead if I did. He tried to speak, but his voice caught. The firelight flickered across his face, across the streaks of blood on his arm. They'll come again, he whispered. And when they do, you run. You don't look back. I won't leave you, she said. He met her gaze, his eyes dark and unbroken, the same way they'd been the night she first found him. Then you'll die here too. The wind rose again, carrying faint echoes from the distance. Hoofbeats, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. She turned toward the sound, her breath shaking, realizing it wasn't over. Not yet, and as she lifted the rifle again, standing between the wounded Apache and the dark horizon, the first flash of lightning split the sky, marking the moment before everything would break. The thunder rolled across the open sky, echoing through the valley as if the land itself were holding its breath. The woman stood near the broken fence, her heart pounding, the rifle heavy in her hands. The Apache was beside her, his breathing shallow but steady, his hand pressed to the wound at his side. The clouds above gathered thick and dark, turning the air cold with the scent of coming rain. From the ridge beyond the trees came the faint rhythm of hoofbeats, slow at first, then faster, until they merged into one steady drum of danger. She could see them now through the mist, dark figures riding down, rifles slung across their backs, faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats. These were not the same men as before. These were the ones who followed vengeance more than gold. He shifted his weight, eyes narrowing. They'll come from both sides, he said quietly. They know the land well enough to corner us. She swallowed hard. Can we reach the hills? He shook his head. Not carrying me. Her eyes burned, but she steadied her voice. Then we make them believe we're already gone. He looked at her, the faintest trace of surprise in his expression. For the first time, she wasn't trembling. You think like someone who's seen fear before, he said softly. I've lived with it a long time, she answered. It doesn't scare me anymore. He gave a short nod. Then you'll do what I say. They moved quickly inside the cabin. He gathered what little ammunition was left, pushing a pistol into her hands. If they break through, you fire twice. Not 3 times, too. Then you run through the back and follow the trail by the creek. The water will cover your scent. She shook her head. I'm not leaving you. He looked at her then, his voice quiet but sharp. I didn't ask. Outside, the hoofbeats grew louder. The wind picked up, blowing open the half-broken shutters. The storm clouds gathered above the mountains, flashes of lightning flickering across the sky. She crouched behind the window, peering through a crack in the wood. 5 riders this time. They dismounted halfway down the slope, spreading out in a slow, deliberate line. One of them, tall with a scar down his cheek, gestured toward the cabin with a rifle. They know you're hurt, she whispered. He didn't answer. He was loading his last rounds into the rifle, his movements calm and practiced. Every motion was silent, purposeful. When the first shot came, it shattered the window beside her. She ducked, glass raining over her hands. He fired back once, the recoil sharp in the confined space. One of the men dropped, rolling into the mud. Stay low, he said. She did as he said, her pulse roaring in her ears. Another shot cracked, hitting the doorframe. The board splintered, dust filling the air. They'll try to circle, he muttered. They'll burn it like before. She looked toward the small shelf where the wooden carving still stood. For a moment, her fear gave way to something else. understanding. That small figure wasn't just for the dead. It was for memory, for all he'd lost and all he'd refused to give up. He noticed her glance, his eyes following hers. "That belonged to my brother," he said quietly as another bullet struck the wall. "He carved it the night before the soldiers came. Said it would remind us who we were." She met his eyes, her voice trembling. "And now it reminds you why you fight." He nodded once, his jaw tightening. "Now it reminds me what I can't lose again." A sudden crash shook the cabin. The back window shattered and a figure climbed through the opening, mud dripping from his boots. She lifted the pistol, hands trembling. The man saw her and raised his gun, but she fired first. One shot, clean and sharp. He fell backward, his weapon clattering to the floor. The room filled with smoke and the scent of gunpowder. Her ears rang. He turned, saw the man on the floor and gave her a look, half warning, half pride. "You did what you had to." Before she could respond, the sound of galloping returned. The others were pulling back toward the ridge, shouting to each other through the storm. He limped toward the door, watching as the last of them disappeared behind the trees. "They'll be back," she said softly. He nodded. "They'll bring more next time." Rain began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, soaking through the roof and into the dirt floor. The fire hissed out, leaving the cabin dim and cold. She helped him sit near the hearth, pressing a cloth against his wound. "You need a doctor," she whispered. "There's no doctor within 50 miles, he said with a faint smile. "And even if there was, he wouldn't treat me." She looked at him, her throat tightening. "You can't keep living like this." He closed his eyes for a moment. "The land remembers who it belongs to. I can't leave it behind." She understood then that this place, the hills, the river, even the silence, was all he had left of the world he came from. Leaving it would mean losing everything twice. When the storm passed, the valley was washed clean. The smoke had thinned, and the horizon glowed faintly gold under the rising sun. She stepped outside, the air cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The men were gone. Only the trampled mud and burned brush remained. She turned toward the cabin where he sat in the doorway, his arm wrapped in bandages. "They won't stop, will they?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, but they'll think twice before coming back," she smiled faintly. "Maybe fear works both ways." He looked up at her, the hint of something softer in his eyes. "You've got more fire in you than most I've met. The city didn't take that away." She lowered her gaze. "The city took everything I had. Maybe that's why I came here." He studied her for a long moment. "Then maybe the land brought you where you needed to be." She sat beside him, watching the river shimmer in the distance. The valley looked different now, not as empty, not as cruel. The silence felt alive. As the sun climbed higher, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a worn letter. "This was from my brother," she said quietly. "He said he was heading west to build a life. I thought he was still out there." He looked at the letter, then at her. "He might be," he said. "But if he isn't, he'd want you to keep moving forward." She nodded slowly. "And you?" He glanced toward the ridge. "I'll stay here. Someone has to keep watch." The wind picked up again, stirring the wet grass. She folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into her pocket. "Then I'll help you," she said. For a while, he didn't argue. He simply nodded once as if he'd known that's what she would say. Days passed. They buried the fallen men in the lower field, marked their graves with small stones. The rain returned, washing away the footprints and the blood. The cabin stood firm, scarred but still standing. He healed slowly, the color returning to his face. Sometimes she caught him staring toward the horizon, as if he were listening to something far away. Other times he'd teach her how to track by the prints in the dirt, how to listen for the sound of a horse long before it appeared. Each evening they'd sit by the fire, quiet, but not alone. The fear that had filled the cabin now felt like part of its story, like the old marks on its walls. One night as the fire burned low, she turned to him. "When I first saw you, I thought you were going to kill me." He smiled faintly. "You're still here." "I guess I didn't test your limits after all," she said. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "You did," he said softly. "And that's why you survived." The wind outside rustled through the pines, carrying the sound of running water from the creek. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, a lonely, endless sound that echoed across the hills. She watched the flames dance, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. Out here, the world didn't forgive easily, but it gave second chances in its own way. As dawn broke again, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, the woman stepped outside the cabin. The air was cool, and the valley stretched endlessly before her, wild and open. She could still hear his voice behind her, calm and certain. "Don't test my limits," he'd said once, but now she understood what he really meant. It wasn't about control or power. It was about survival, about knowing when to fight and when to stand still. She looked back at the small cabin, smoke rising gently from its chimney, and smiled faintly. In a land that had taken so much from both of them, they had found something rare, a reason to stay, a reason to keep the fire burning, and as the morning sun climbed higher over the mountains, the valley seemed to breathe again, alive and endless, holding their story within it like a secret it would never tell.